So if we have to graph the function y equals cosine 2x minus pi, then subtracted by 2, there's a lot going on there. We should start with the graph of cosine of x, if that's something we're not familiar with. The graph of cosine of x looks something like this. It starts at the top of the wave, okay? And since there's no number written in front, the amplitude's 1. That means it goes down to -1, then back up to +1. And cosine of x repeats itself every time we go 2 pi units on the x-axis. Now we can do some manipulation. If you do cosine of x minus 2, that drops it down. Instead of having starting at 1 at the very top, it goes down 2 units. So -1 is now the top, because the midline, something called the midline, has been reduced by 2. Usually the midline is right across here on the x-axis at y equals 0. The midline is now y equals -2 because of this part right here. So we should see it's symmetrical going horizontally there. Okay, and then it does the normal wave. This is cosine of x minus 2. So we're getting an idea of our graph by slowly modifying that original cosine of x graph. Let's see, what else can we do? Let's talk about the period next. Actually, let's rewrite this. Usually with cosine and sine, we have this form. And you'll see slight variations over the internet, but it's y equals a cosine of x, b, don't know why I'm doing lowercase and capital letters, but it's x plus c in parentheses plus d. Okay, so you can see that there's a number factored out. There's no extra coefficient over here. Look, b is factored out of the entire parentheses, so this one is not exactly like that. We don't have a factored piece. So what we need to do is say y equals cosine of 2 parentheses x minus pi over 2 minus 2. See how I factored out a 2 from both of these terms? Put it on the outside. Now we can easily identify the phase shift. The phase shift is pi over 2 units to the right. So what that means is if you had like cosine of x minus pi over 2, notice my coefficient is now 1, so you could factor out a 1 if you want. That just means instead of starting at 0 at x and then being at the peak, we start doing our sine wave pi over 2 units to the right. And you might be thinking, are you making a mistake? Do you mean pi over 2 units to the left? Because there's a minus sign there. It's pi over 2 units to the right. You could check that out by plugging in some values. If we plug in pi over 2 in for x, plot the point, you'll see that the pi over 2, the phase shift happens opposite of the direction that you see. Minus usually means go to the left. But x minus pi over 2, the phase shift actually means go pi over 2 units to the right. And now we can deal with that 2. The 2 affects our period. The period is 2 pi divided by b. And this is our b right here. Okay. Usually we say absolute value of b too. So we know what b is. B is 2. So if we simplify this, the period, 2 pi divided by 2, is just pi. So that means instead of repeating itself every 2 pi on the x-axis, it repeats itself every pi. And I think we've got everything. We know the amplitude is 1, because that's the number out front. The period, that's an important part of the graph, is pi. It's symmetrical around y equals -2. We should say it is, the midline is y equals -2. And then we have a phase shift of pi over 2 units to the right. Alright, so let me see if I can keep this and delete everything else. No, probably not. Oh yeah, there we go. No! Those are the key characteristics. You need to know your amplitude, the period, the phase shift, and the axis of symmetry, and then you're ready to graph. And then Newton, if you're trying to graph it, it just is a matter of moving those dots. I think I remember the black dot was the first dot you got to move. But basically this graph, I'm going to think about pi over 2 units to the right to start off. So I'd move like that black dot, pi over 2 units to the right. It starts at, the midline is probably what I'd think of next. So we go down to -2 for our midline. So that means we start at the peak of the amplitude, but the peak of the amplitude's been shifted over here. So this is roughly what our graph should look like. Right, here's our midline, y equals -2 that we saw at the beginning. Pi over 2 units to the right, that's why I didn't start here on the y-axis, I started over here. And then a period, I just need to make a note that this is not, this is going to be pi over 2 plus pi, which would give you 3 pi over 2. This is when the graph starts repeating itself, because it started at pi over 2. And if you add pi x units to it, then it should be starting to repeat itself at 3 pi over 2, because you add one period to it. And I think that's everything. Once you move those dots, it should be the graph. One last thing I thought of is you should be able to touch the points in the graph and see the coordinates. This should be pi over 2 on the x and -1 on the y. And this should be, we said 3 pi over 2 on the x, -1 on the y. Down here, halfway in between, this should be pi -3, right? Because -1's the peak. That means we need to go down 1 below the midline. So we need to go to -3 for the valley. So you should be able to click those points, and those should be showing up if you have the right graph.